Welcome, everyone. Great to have you here tonight. My name is Avi Zeraviv, one of the founding members of Therapists for Palestine. We are a collective standing in solidarity for Palestinian freedom and liberation. I'm here in Pickering, Ontario, traditional territory of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nations and Williams Treaty signatories of the Mississaugas and Chippewa Nations. As therapists, we spend time seeing what is in the way of wholeness and working to open new channels of possibility and aliveness for our clients. In the same way, all forms of dehumanization and injustice are obstacles that keep all of us down and need to be addressed if we are to realize personal and collective empowerment. Tonight's event, titled Difficult Conversations, Addressing Peace and Justice in Palestine, Israel, is about how systems of oppression shape mental health and how simply looking at the individual as an isolated entity removed from culture, environment, and land is an incomplete picture of the psyche. We'll have time towards the end of the conversation for question and answer, and have selected some of the questions you emailed us for this, particularly questions a number of you have asked. We are also recording this event, and we'll email the recording to everyone who registered, including those on the wait list who may not have been able to join here tonight. It's my great honor to introduce two amazing souls to you, Gabor Maté and Hammam Farah. Hammam Farah is also a founding member of Therapists for Palestine, a Palestinian-Canadian psychotherapist, activist, and speaker. He was born in Gaza and lost family members and friends to the Israeli onslaught on the Strip. As a therapist by profession, Hammam has been working with Gazan patients and facilitating grief circles while navigating his own experience of loss and the emotional impact of genocide. Hammam is also the executive director of the Elham Fund, a nonprofit that delivers medicine and cash transfers to the people of Gaza. Named after his great aunt Elham Farah, who was murdered by the Israeli army on November 13th, 2023, exactly 1 year ago today. In March 2024, Hammam initiated a lawsuit against Canadian officials responsible for arms sales to Israel. Dr. Gabor Maté is a retired physician, renowned speaker, best-selling author of 5 books published in 43 languages, including his latest New York Times bestseller, The Myth of Normal, Trauma, Illness, and Healing in a Toxic Culture. He is a personal mentor of mine and a tireless activist and advocate for Palestinian freedom and liberation. Without further ado, I welcome you both, Gabor and Hammam.
Thank you, Avi. Oh, Gabor, you may be muted.
Oh, yeah. I'm just thanking Avi and asking you to take the lead on this conversation.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Dr. Gabor, for joining us. So I have I'm really honored to have you here with us today. And I have a list of questions that I will be asking in addition to 1 or 2 questions we received from Q&A. But I'd also like us to have a conversation as well about some personal aspects of this that I've experienced, and I think it might be really illuminating to many of our viewers. But I'll start with the first question here, which is that so Gabor, you're known for your insights into the role of stress, trauma, and early childhood experiences in shaping mental health and addiction. And you've also been speaking out about the genocide taking place in Gaza. So how do these two things intersect, or what is the relationship between mental health and trauma treatment and the events happening in Palestine?
Well, now, it depends who we're talking about. If we're talking about witnesses not in Gaza, but here in Canada, for example, and those that care, a lot of people don't care, and a lot of people, even if they do care, they don't have the information because they're getting a very skewed view of reality through the media. But if you're talking about how is it affecting people here, that's a very different question for how is it affecting people over there. So which one are you asking about?
Um,
And
on,
also of course, let's say you're Palestinian Canadian, such as you are, Haman.
yeah.
Um, it's your relatives that are being slaughtered, and that is bound to have a very different impact than somebody who feels bad about the situation, but doesn't have that kind of personal connection with it. So when you're asking how is it going to affect people's health, it depends. Let alone if you're a Palestinian child whose parents are, 20,000 kids have been orphaned, and when we talk about a Palestinian kid being orphaned, we're not just talking about mom and dad dying. We're talking about extended families being wiped out
Mhm.
because
Mhm.
people live, as you know, in large extended families. And there's 20,000 orphans. At least there was 19,000 a couple of months ago. I assume there must be at least 20,000 by now. The kids who are watching the bombing. Again, how to answer that question depends very much on which population we're talking about.
Mhm. And what about sort of, I think, more specifically, the role of a lot of people have been wondering what is the role of psychotherapy and trauma treatment? Um,
But again, it depends on who is the client,
right.
okay, and what have they gone through.
But therapy can.
But psychotherapy is one of the major modalities with, to deliver healing from trauma. I mean, that's the whole idea of psychotherapy. Well, that's not the whole idea of all kinds of psychotherapy. Some psychotherapies completely ignore trauma and they're just concerned with symptoms and behaviors and ideas. But there's many psychotherapeutic modalities that are aimed at dealing with trauma. So it has a huge role. But again, it depends on which population we're talking about.
And what about the question around now? It's not an easy question because it might be too broad for us to get
Yeah.
into and to answer. But is therapy political? There's this question going around that is therapy political, or can therapy be political? And if so, in what context?
Well, that debate has been going on for a long time
Mm.
um, on psychiatry and psychotherapy, because the question is, Eric Fromm said that mental health. Eric Fromm is a great German Jewish,
Oh yeah, I'm a fan.
psychologist, social psychologist, and he said that mental health is not the question of the individual adjusting to a society, but society adjusting to the needs of human beings. So there's been a debate for a long time. Um, when we're helping people function better, are we simply helping them adjust to a fundamentally insane society? And should we be doing that? Well, what's the answer? The answer is when somebody comes to me for help with depression or anxiety or fibromyalgia or multiple sclerosis or any number of conditions, my job is to help them with that condition. And it's not my job it may be my job to help them understand the conditions around them that help to contribute to the onset of those maladies or those ailments. But it's certainly not my job to give them a political education. Um, if they bring it up, then we discuss it. but not from the point of view of me or you trying to convince them of a particular point of view. So I know that in the write-up to this particular event, some people were a bit confused, that they thought we were advocating that when somebody comes to us for psychotherapy, we need to talk about Gaza. Well, actually, it doesn't work. Neither you or I believe that that's the case. We have to take the client where they're at.
That's right.
And it's not for us to introduce our political views. And
Yeah.
I know there was a question that somebody submitted. Maybe I'll refer to it now. That this is a therapist who's got a strongly Zionist client, and the therapist completely disagrees with the client politically. And the only thing I can say to that therapist is, you got a decision to make. What you cannot do is to engage that client in political debate. That's not why they're coming to you. If you can work with them, you find enough space in between yourself to work with that person, do it. But if their views are too upsetting for you, you need to say that. You need to say, I'm sorry. I'm not here to debate your political opinions, but the way you see the world and this situation is so different from the way I see it that I get too triggered around you. So I'm not the one to help you. It's not that you don't deserve help. It's just that I'm not the one who can give it to you. So let's find you somebody who doesn't get triggered around these views, and you work with them. So, but it's not for that therapist to try and argue with that client politically. And I think you and I would agree on that.
Yes. Yeah, I do agree on that. And yeah, there seems to be, because over the past decade or so, there seems to be a trend or a camp of in the sector of therapists who have been um, vocal about uh, a, a so-called kind of responsibility for of therapists to bring, for the therapist to bring the politics into the sessions to the clients. But no, I'm not of that perspective personally. um, I, I I would agree that the client, we work with what the client brings to the.
Now, mind you, when I work with indigenous people, when I work with indigenous people are racialized. You got to talk politics to some extent
Mhm.
because racialized minorities tend to develop what the American Black psychologist Ken Hardy calls an assaulted sense of self, which means they take on a view of themselves that the perpetrator has of them. So
Right.
when I work with indigenous groups, I certainly talk about the residential schools. I certainly talk about the impact of colonialism, and so that they have to decolonize their minds. They have to get get beyond the belief that there's something wrong with them to begin with. So politics may come into it in that sense, but politics not in a sense of current events, but history. And certainly same with Jewish clients. If they are affected multi-generationally by the Holocaust, you can't ignore that. And you need to bring it up and to say this does not begin with you. It did not begin even perhaps with your parents, but it is transgenerational, and it's not your fault, and you're not culpable for your so-called dysfunctions. So I think in that sense, we can't ignore history or social circumstances, but that's different from bringing in our views about any particular political event into the conversation.
Yeah, that is different. I find myself with Palestinian clients or patients. Sometimes you do need to bring in politics in the sense of history. So, for example, you have a client who um, has anger issues and perhaps a history with an angry father, and this seems to be a trend in the Arab community and angry Arab fathers. Um, and there may be, you know, a history there that's connected to the Nakba and the expulsion of Palestinians, the experience of the father growing up,
Yeah.
and his father, and going back generations. And the client, here's the catch: the client might not even be aware of that.
Oh, I know. When I worked with addicted clients in the downtown east side of Vancouver, a large percentage of whom were Indigenous, um, they didn't make any connection between their childhood experience, all the multi-generational trauma, and their addictions. And yet, trauma is the source experience when it comes to addiction. So then it's my role to bring in that awareness. Again, this is not your fault. It didn't begin with you. It's multi-generational, and it has happened in a certain historical context. So that sometimes is necessary. Mind you, that information is helpful, but it doesn't itself heal anybody. You know, so the healing is a deeper process than that. But it's sometimes important to bring it in, and same with, you know, not generations of Nakba survivors and generations of Holocaust survivors. Sometimes it's important to bring that history in.
Yeah. Um, Now that's the kind of historical bit. Now in the present, we want to talk about, I want to sort of address what's happening beyond the therapy room, beyond the
Yeah,
therapy.
yeah.
Like, um, the what we wanted to advocate for, especially with having this event, while you're correct, we're not advocating for in the therapy room that the therapist would bring in their political views. However, I do think that there needs to be a case made for therapists to advocate outside of the consulting room, outside of the therapy, through their associations and institutions. I know, for example, like after October 7th of last year, the American Psychoanalytic Association, you know, released statements expressing outrage at condemning the attack on October 7th, but then complete silence on Gaza, on what happened to Gaza, still till today. And despite pleas from some of the members for the executive to release a statement, it was completely denied. And
Yeah.
other associations are doing the same thing.
Well, it's another scandal as far as I'm concerned, that all these health associations and medical associations and therapeutic associations, they can watch this deliberate assault on an entire healthcare system, the deliberate targeting of health personnel, of which there's all kinds of documentation, the torturing to death of physicians, of for which there's documentation, um, the destruction of hospitals, um, clinics, the interdiction of medical aid reaching a starving and sick population, the destruction of medical equipment. People can't even get an X-ray anymore or an MRI scan if they're sick. The denial of the transfer of medicines across borders. That all these health organizations can watch all this and not say a peep. And rest assured that if it was happening almost anywhere else in the world, there'd be an outcry. Imagine, I mean, imagine if there was a deliberate Russian attempt to destroy all the hospitals in Ukraine, to target medical personnel specifically, to shoot doctors and nurses as they're operating on patients, to torture medical personnel. Would there not be an outcry? So that's simply a political decision, which is made, I think, for two reasons. One is people might politically actually support Israel, not really wanting to look at what Israel is actually doing, but just out of, for all kinds of reasons of loyalty. And there also might be a fear in a lot of other people that if they do speak out, they will be ostracized and challenged and even threatened, which is the case. Because I know of physicians and I know of counselors who have spoken out, saying no more than Israeli critics of Israeli policies have said. I mean, saying no more than Israeli historians have said, saying no more than Israeli journalists have said publicly, saying no more than, like, two of the leading genocide scholars in the world are Israeli Jews, Ross Siegel and Omar Bartov. And they've both called this genocide.
Mhm.
Now, if a Canadian says it, they're accused of being anti-Semites. And yet they're saying what these Israeli Jews are saying, Israeli-born Jews. Omar Bartov at least served in the Israeli army. He was a commander in the Israeli army. So when somebody who's not Jewish dares to repeat what Bartov said, now they're being attacked, and B'nai B'rith, a Jewish organization, actually goes after people to threaten them with loss of their license if they continue to speak out, and they complain to their associations. So people are not speaking out either because of a loyalty to their conception of what Israel is, or out of fear.
Fear. Yeah. Yeah, I'm a therapist who was born in Gaza, and several of my family members have been killed in the past year.
Yeah.
Much of our land was stolen prior to that. We had beautiful orchards in Beit Hanun, which is in the northernmost part of Gaza, plowed up by the IDF. Um, but I've been lucky to be able to be outspoken here in Canada about the issue because of a lot of the connections that I made over the years within the Palestine Solidarity movement. Uh, made it much more easier for me to voice my opinions. But the Israel lobby group, B'nai B'rith, did come after my license, and this was the third time that an Israel lobby group tries to get my license revoked, third or fourth time even. But yeah, over the past year, they complained over a series of tweets that I made last year, but they failed to get my license revoked.
Well, in 2014, is that when Operation Cast Lead happened? Was that 2014 or whatever they called it then?
In 14 was Protective Edge.
Protective Edge. These are nice names, Protective Edge, Cast Lead, brilliant names. You have to hand it to them for coming up with good names. And they killed hundreds of children, bombing them. It wasn't the first time. And I wrote an article for a Canadian newspaper. I got a letter from the BC College of Physicians that somebody had complained that I was spreading anti-Semitic propaganda, and something like that, and that they were arguing that I should lose my license. Well, the bad news was that I didn't have a license anymore because I had retired from the practice of medicine a few years earlier, and the college wasn't coming after me. They just said you should know that this complaint has been made, But surely these days, I know it. If I was still a licensed physician, there'd be all kinds of complaints to the College of Physicians.
Yeah, absolutely. But our others aren't as lucky as we've been.
No,
so many people have been let go, fired, delicensed. How can we best respond to these incidents and to our professional associations and colleges and workplaces?
How I respond is, in the case of a counselor in British Columbia who was being harassed that way by the B'nai B'rith, I wrote this 5-page letter quoting all the Israeli critics who were saying exactly what she was saying. And I was saying to her association, her lawyer, that it doesn't even matter whether Omar Bartov or Ross Siegel or Gideon Levy or Ilan Pappy or Avi Schleim or Avi Shalit or Tom Segev or Sima Flapan or Amir Ahas or any number of, or Bet Selem or any number of Israeli organizations or historians or journalists are right or not. That's not the issue. The issue is, if they're saying it, how can you accuse somebody of anti-Semitism for saying the same thing? So it doesn't matter if, it's not a question of who's even right politically. It's a question of, do people have the right to express an opinion that Israelis and Jews have also expressed? And if they have, how can you call it anti-Semitism? You know, so that's, and so that on the level of these organizations, that case needs to be made over and over and over again. That the person who's posting something online about mass murder in Gaza or torture, or a couple of weeks ago, there was a blog by a Tel Aviv professor who said that the Israeli policy in Gaza is extermination, expulsion, and replacement. Now, how can you be accused of anti-Semitism when, or Israelis are using the word apartheid? So that our job is to support these people who are being challenged and to say to their associations, let's not be ridiculous. People have the right to express their political opinions. They don't have the right. Now, if somebody comes to a psychologist or a therapist who's Jewish or just pro-Israel or whatever, and they express that to the therapist, and the therapist starts arguing with them and trying to prove them that I'm wrong, I can see making a case that that's not appropriate. You and I talked about that.
Yeah.
The therapist can say, look, I'm sorry, I can't deal with your opinions. I'm not the one to help you. But the associations need to stand behind individuals who are expressing their right to speak, their freedom of speech. These associations need to have the backbone to stand up to that kind of ideological blackmail that B'nai B'rith is so good at practicing.
It brings me to a kind of a thinking about how some of the associations have expressed an unwillingness to engage the topic because some of their members support the Israeli policies.
Yeah.
And that makes it difficult when they use the argument that, well, it's not going to represent all our members.
I think there's some truth to that.
Yeah.
But at least they should encourage some public discussion about it.
Mm.
And they need to stand behind those people who are being assaulted or attacked for expressing their opinions.
Yeah.
Mind you, you could express an opinion that it's not okay to destroy hospitals.
Yeah.
It's not okay to torture doctors to death. I mean, you could say that without necessarily taking a side. And that's not taking a side. That's just saying it's not right to do that. No matter who's doing it. And if some people don't agree with it, let them debate it. But at least the issue should be discussed. The silence is deafening.
Yeah. I know some associations have even attacked their own members for trying to discuss.
Oh, I know. I wonder if we should take questions from the audience, Hammam. I mean, questions that people sent in.
Sure, yeah, okay. There's some of that, and then I'll get into some other another area I wanted to talk to you about before we leave, but there are a few questions here I could ask from the audience.
Sure. And it's up to you. I'm just wondering if we should do that. You know.
Oh, yeah, well, we have some time still.
Yeah.
How do you, so here's a question. How do you make meaning of the fact that we're witnessing support for an ongoing genocide from within the therapy field? Therapists do years of their own internal work, are constantly self-reflecting and confronting difficult feelings and their own darkness. Yet today we see that they refuse to publicly condemn or collectively speak out against this genocide.
Well, I think we've addressed that question already.
Yeah, and I'm noticing a lot of the questions that were submitted, we've already addressed.
What I was going to say there, what I can tell you is that this is a very emotionally charged issue. And I mean, I have a lot of followers, a lot of therapists study my course, and I've had all kinds of people, Jewish students, who said, "You've betrayed us. You've turned your back on us. You've chosen to support terrorism and side with the enemy, you know, and we're not going to follow you anymore." I say, okay, that's how it is. You know, I get it. I get how you feel. I get how you see it. I used to see it that way at some point, but I haven't for a long time. If you're interested in the conversation, let's have it. But if you're not going to follow me, don't follow me. You know, I mean, that's certainly your right. But it's a very emotional issue, and people have a hard time being rational about it. They have a hard time even acknowledging the facts. It's just like they live in a different world where what we see happening in front of our eyes is not happening. Where Israeli leaders can declare their intentions openly and nobody hears it. And there's nothing we can do about that. I mean, that's just how it is. And sometimes, and it's not the first time that people have been unconscious. You know, there were politics invites unconsciousness. I can give you lots of examples of that, both on the left and on the right. On the left, for example, for a long time, there was real silence about the crimes of Stalin. People just didn't, you know, because they supported the Soviet Union. Then there was the torture of people at Guantanamo, and psychologists stayed silent about it. Then there was the mass killings of the Vietnam War, children being napalmed. We just watched, you know, so, and very few people spoke up. So tragic it is, and I'm not minimizing it, but there's nothing particularly new about the silence in the face of horror. It's not new.
It's just so interesting that psychologists, therapists, mental health professionals would do that. It perplexes me. Someone who's done internal work and supposedly has their emotional capacities strengthened through therapy are unable to sort of look beyond their personal relationships.
Yeah, or they might not be politically political. I mean, look, it's not just psychologists. Like, the fact is that the media confuses everybody. Like, take this incident in Amsterdam last week.
Yeah.
Big anti-Jewish pogrom. The fact that these Maccabi football supporters are fascists and have been for years, and their favorite chant is "death to the Arabs" and "fuck the Arabs," which they do at their games, and they did it in Amsterdam in public. There were videos chanting all this stuff, you know, "death to the Arabs," let the idea "fuck the Arabs." They were doing this the night before the game. They trashed a taxi the night before the game.
Yeah.
Went around pulling down Palestinian flags and chanting these slogans in Amsterdam, which is a big Muslim population. And then during the game, when there was a minute of silence for the people who died in the Spanish floods, the Maccabee supporters were chanting, "Fuck the Arabs," because Spain had taken a principled position on Gaza, relatively speaking. And then when the violence happens afterwards, it's an anti-Semitic pogrom. And did you read in the Canadian papers about any of this background? In the New York Times? Barely, if at all. And so then, so people are confused because to them it's just, okay, these Jews were being attacked. The fact that these Jews were these violent and envenomed racists, the worst, the worst, most racist segment of Israeli society shows up to support that football team. When that football team had a couple of Arab players, the players went, the fans went nuts. None of this is presented. All this presented is groups attacking Jews. So that's how it's presented. So people are confused. They don't have the information. And to get the information, you really have to understand that the mass media, for the most part, is a megaphone for whatever the American policy happens to be. So you can't blame people for being, it's not just therapists, it's also that everybody, people are politically in the dark. And that's what we're also seeing.
That's a good point.
And, you have to go out of your way to find the information.
Yeah.
Like you have to watch programs like Democracy Now! Or Gray Zone or Al Jazeera. And most people aren't going to do that. They just look at the mass media. So it's not just lack of psychological presence, but it's also confusion and ignorance.
Yeah, true. There's the manufacturing of consent.
Yeah.
Media.
Yeah, exactly.
A question here. What about those watching the images and videos of the atrocities over social media every day for the past year? Is there, you believe there's an emotional impact on witnessing this secondhand?
There is. And it takes two forms. One is it triggers people's own unresolved trauma. Because at some point they were helpless, they were being hurt, and nobody came to their help, nobody came to their aid. And they were devastated. So watching this happen to a large group of people, particularly children, is going to trigger all that for a lot of people. I know it had that effect on me to some extent until I began to deal with it differently. Then the other is there's something called moral injury. And moral injury is when you watch terrible things happen and you're helpless in the face of it, or you perceive yourself as helpless. And that can induce guilt in people.
Yeah. Speaking of guilt.
And I'm sorry. And there's a third, which is that I'm sure this is true for you. It might be true for a lot of people who are watching this event, is there's this sorrow and this grief and this rage, and all coupled with a sense of helplessness, in the sense that it doesn't matter what work you've done, and you and I talked about this, and what work I've done, we haven't saved the life of a single child. Well, that hurts. And people have to deal with that sorrow. They have to deal with that grief. They have to deal with that rage. And again, it's not the first time in history that people have watched helplessly other people being led to the slaughter. It's really hard. It's really hard to watch and to take in.
Yeah.
I was just watching a movie. In 1936, the Olympics were held in Berlin. And I was thinking, what kind of a world
Wow.
would go to Berlin in 1936 to have sports competitions? Now, the genocide hadn't happened yet, but there were already concentration camps in Germany for the enemies of the Nazis. And there were already all these anti-Semitic laws, and Jews were being persecuted and attacked and expelled from universities and forbidden from their professions. And the world goes to Berlin to have these Olympics, universal brotherhood, and camaraderie. I mean, that's the world that we live in.
Yes, not the world that we lived in, but the world that we still live in.
We still live in, yeah.
That was kind of a thing.
Yeah.
That
Now, politically, because of the Western disgust at the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and I'm not going to go into the politics of it, but Russian sports people can't, if they participate in a tennis tournament, they can't have the flag of their country. Now, the Israelis have killed many more civilians, 4 times as many civilians, about in 1 year, as the Russians have killed in Ukraine in the 2.5 years of war. I'm not making the one right. All I'm saying is, but Israeli athletes can compete wearing their flag. Americans killed 3 million people in Vietnam, 2 million people, 500,000 people in Iraq. They can wear their flag. So this is just political hypocrisy and political cynicism is what it is. And we have to watch this. That's the world we live in.
you have to watch it helplessly.
Well, helplessly. People are not as helpless as they think they are. They may not be able to change the situation in the short term, but that doesn't mean they're helpless. They can support people with medical aid and food aid. They can speak out. They can spread the word. They can help to educate others, those that will listen. This is a long-term process. So we may not be able to save a single life today, but that doesn't mean we're totally helpless. Helplessness is more of a state of mind than a lot of, there have been people in terrible situations who didn't perceive themselves as helpless.
That's interesting. Yeah, and we see the tremendous pressure being put on those in power to stop this genocide every day. It's just that it's the lack of results, I think, the lack of outcome that's been so frustrating. And it's not just it's not the guilt. You were talking about rage before. I think it's really the level of rage that has consumed so many of us, including myself, about the situation. That's what can often be the rage is what's often underneath that feeling of helplessness. When you feel helpless, you're saying you're not actually helpless. That's actually the rage you're feeling underneath. It's so strong, it's so powerful, it's all consuming, and you have to regulate it in order to continue surviving in this society, or else you either lose your license or you go to prison.
Yeah, well, do you want to give them that victory of being consumed by your rage?
No, absolutely not. But this is a good segue into what I wanted to bring in personally. I want to share with you and share with viewers what happened to my great aunt Ilham, and kind of my feelings around it. Last year, as Avi was saying, today is the 1 year anniversary of her death. She's my mother's aunt, and she was sheltering at the Holy Family Catholic Church in Gaza. Before that, at the Orthodox St. Porphyrius Orthodox Church, but it was bombed, and she moved to the Catholic Church. We're part of Gaza's small Christian community, and but she couldn't. She didn't want to shelter there anymore. She couldn't stand it. She wanted to go home. So she found a ride to take her. She didn't tell anyone she was leaving. She found a ride, and the driver stopped before he got to her neighborhood. He said, "It's too dangerous. The army's all over the place. You're on your own from here." So she got out of the car and she started walking. And just before she got to her house, she saw that an Israeli sniper was stationed on the rooftop, and he shot her in the leg. She started to bleed out and fell on the ground. The neighbors could see her on the ground, but they couldn't go out to rescue her because of all the snipers that were stationed in the area. And it was just harrowing that she had her cell phone. She called the family in the church. They said they would reach out to the Red Cross, which they did, but the Red Cross said they couldn't reach the Israeli army to get permission to pick up her body. And there was just no response from the Israeli army all night. And the next day, we heard that she bled out to death. And about 2 months later, we learned that her body was run over by a tank as well. And that the pieces of her body were found and collected by the church workers who were able to go and collect the body, whatever remained of her body. And that was that. And then about 2 to 3 weeks ago, almost a year after her death, I found out that she was alive when she was run over by the tank and flattened. She had taken her purse and put it over her face as the tank was approaching her. And they know this because the purse was found flat on her face and her brains were splattered all over. I just found this out a few weeks ago. So, the story just keeps getting more gruesome, and it's just had a huge effect on us and on my work. For me, establishing this nonprofit that sends medication and cash transfers to people in Gaza, and we made it in her name, the Ilham Fund. But, her death, along with others in my family and other people, and what I've been seeing every day on the news and on social media, it's just that's what's kind of accumulated all this rage. And I was telling you when we had a chance to briefly speak before this, I was telling you that I was feeling guilty, and you were asking me where's the guilt coming from, and I wasn't really able to answer that. But as I reflected more on it, I found I've been thinking about the guilt that I've been holding from not being as connected to my great aunt and other relatives as I feel I should have been over the years. I remember Auntie Ilham did try to call me. She did try to reach out not too long before last October, and I ignored her call. And ever since then, it's been very hard for me to kind of reflect on that.
Why did you know? Why do you think you ignored her call? First of all, listen, it's an awful story you just told. When I say awful, it's awful that this should happen to a human being. And this is happening to human beings every day. That's the reality. Okay. But going back to I'm so sorry about your aunt, and I'm so sorry for what you had to go through, what your whole family has gone through. just as, to be fair, we have to be so sorry for what some of those Israeli families went through on October the 7th. I'm not saying that the two are equal, but people have gone through some terrible, terrible things. But my question to you is, for now, how come you didn't? Why do you think you didn't answer your aunt call?
I think there was an avoidant part of me that just didn't want
Was
to
that
open the door for her to call
okay?
all the time.
Because it was too painful for you?
Painful.
Yeah. Okay. So here's the headline in the newspaper. Human being acts avoidant to protect himself from pain. How surprising would you find that?
I wouldn't find.
Okay.
I mean, it
And
was overwhelming. Would have been overwhelming.
okay. And if I told you a story where I was avoiding something because part of me just couldn't face it. As a result, I didn't call somebody back who then died. Would you tell me, Gabor, you should feel guilty?
No,
Would you? How come you wouldn't?
I don't see the.
How come you wouldn't?
I don't see the guilt in it.
Oh, okay. So are we living in two different worlds where for Gabor you will have compassion, but for Hammam you won't? Is that how you want to, is that the rules you want to play by?
No.
But actually, what might you say to me? If I told you a somewhat resonating story, what would you say to me? As a therapist, come on, what would you say to me?
If what?
If I told you something like you told me, if I was, if you were my therapist, what would you say to me?
Oh, you couldn't have known.
Okay, what else would you say to me? But yeah, I tell you what I'll say to you. I get your remorse. And it's really too bad you didn't call your aunt. But part of you was trying to avoid something. You were afraid of something. And you hadn't dealt with it yet. You're not perfect. And there's a difference, I would say to you, between remorse and guilt. Remorse is recognizing that you did or didn't do something. Guilt makes you culpable and makes you into a criminal. So have your remorse, I say to you, but deal with the guilt. And like I said in our conversation, and I see that Avi's back online with us, so we must be coming to the end. Um, I, I said to you in our conversation that this guilt that you have, it's been with you long before your aunt died. It started a long time ago when you were helpless and you saw suffering and you couldn't make a difference. When you were 4 years old or 3 years old or 5 years old. So so that guilt, remorse is different. Healthy remorse is okay. Yeah, it would have been really good if you had talked with your aunt, but you weren't ready. That doesn't make you guilty. You see the difference?
Yes.
Well, try not to be as hard as on you. Try to be no more hard on you than you would be on me. That's all I'm telling you. Avi, can we help you? You're online now.
More as a timekeeper to just let you know we're in the last few minutes here. And um,
I think there's one more question, right, Avi?
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Well, let's do this. Another question from the audience. How do we talk to fellow therapists or other mental health professionals about this? And what are your recommendations for how we should advocate for Palestine within the mental health field?
Well, how do you talk to them is you ask them, is it okay if we talk about this? Are you open to a conversation? They can say yes or they can say no. If they say no, you say, okay, thank you. If you say yes, then ask yourself, what's your intention for the conversation? What would you like to come from this conversation? And so when you talk to somebody, you ask them, are you open to this conversation? Because if so, here's what I'd like to be able to tell you. Are you open to hearing it? Can we talk about it? Then you talk to them the best way you can. So they have to have your permission to talk to people. You have to have permission to talk to people. Believe me, I've been through this. You can't beat people over the head. It doesn't matter how right you are. It doesn't matter how righteous you are. It doesn't matter how righteous your cause is. It doesn't matter how many facts and realities you can marshal in support of your point of view. You can't beat people on the head with it. And this is very, very, very difficult. But ideally, we can have compassion for people's confusion and their ignorance and their emotional contradictions. Because which one of us haven't had them?
Okay, Avi, hand it to you from here.
Listening to your conversation, I think we titled this correctly, Difficult Conversations. And I just want to say something that is obvious, but might need to be named. As therapists and people that go to therapy, that's an incredible, the privileged place to be on both sides. The therapist and the client, that's a very privileged, it's a privileged experience to be a therapist or to be a client, and to have the contrast in that privilege when we see something so unbearable.
Yeah.
I think that needs to be spoken. So
Yeah.
And I wanna thank you both for your heart in this conversation, because that's what I underneath the content of what was spoken, there was incredible heart. And even if we haven't solved the mystery of this, which that's not the idea, but I feel that we have the questions are the right questions here. And so thank you both, Gabor, Hammam. Did you want to say something, Gabor?
Well, you know what our problem is? It's very
No.
simple. Our problem is we don't believe Benjamin Netanyahu, because he said in July that the Gaza war is a conflict between barbarism and civilization, a clash between those who glorify death and those who sanctify life. So he who's murdered tens of thousands of Palestinian women and children, he's the one who sanctifies life. Why don't we just believe the guy and then stop worrying about it? That's our problem. We're too cynical, isn't it?
Hmm.
I mean, the evil is beyond absurdity.
I'm glad we're naming it as evil, in the sense that
Yeah,
the actions are evil.
the actions
These
are
are
evil.
evil actions.
Yeah, yeah, it's beyond comprehension. On the emotional level, the heart cannot possibly understand it, you know. And on the gut level, it's just disgusting. The intellect, yeah, we can understand it politically or whatever, but it's really hard. And let's just acknowledge how difficult it is.
I'd like to invite everybody including Gabor and Hammam and everybody watching, to just let's take a breath together and just breathe. Take a breath, and in the midst of this very, very difficult conversation. So will you all take a breath with me? Thank you, Gabor. Thank you, Hammam. And for people watching, I wanted to mention again Hammam's organization, the Elham Fund, which delivers medicine and cash transfers to people on the ground. If you are feeling an urge to do something very practical, I would encourage you to donate. And you can do that through the website, which is elhamfund.ca, ELHAM fund.ca. And that gives us something very, very practical to give some relief, even if it's a flicker of relief. And thank you all for being here. And we're a newly formed collective, Therapists for Palestine. So please keep an eye on your inbox, on your spam, especially for future events, future actions. We're just forming. We've just formed in the last few months. And a really big thank you to all the members of Therapists for Palestine and our supporters. This would not have been possible without all of the hands. And there are many hands behind the scenes, including technical hands right now. And I guess the last thing I want to say is please take care of yourself, take care of each other, and our attempt to take care of the world. And to be continued.
Be with your feelings. Be with your feelings. I think that's another theme that kind of Gabor was implying, that he also said in a previous interview. Just be with them. Be with the helplessness. Be with the guilt.
Take care, you guys. Bye.
Thank you.